The report before us today surfaces painful human stories, all of which cry out for justice and redress. In northern Ethiopia, a young woman was taken to an Eritrean Defense Forces camp where 27 soldiers raped her, as a result of which she contracted HIV. An elderly, visually impaired woman was shot by soldiers after being detained for 3 days while her daughter was raped by members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces in an adjacent room. An adolescent boy was raped in Himora, who later committed suicide. As a wise woman once said, "You can no more win a war than an earthquake." Wars are indeed unwinnable, and yet their social and economic aftershocks affect us all. Throughout history, human progress has been interrupted by plagues, wars, and authoritarian rule. Issues we thought had been consigned to the ash heap of history remain in our daily headlines. We cannot choose the times we live in. We can only choose how we respond. We must not rest until every survivor, every civilian can sleep under the cover of justice. There is no place in the modern world for gender apartheid, for strong men in place of strong institutions, or for medieval wars of looting, pillage, and rape. Women's rights are not Western rights. They are human rights, and they are universal in times of war and peace. Prevention is the best form of protection, including the prevention of conflict itself. We must rise to the challenge of our times. Inaction is not an option. Thank you, Mr. President.
I wish to thank Ms. Pramila Patten for a very extensive and detailed report. And if I could just make a request for my role as chair of this particular meeting, if you could please ensure this is a very important subject, and the testimonies, particularly from some of our survivors, and in accordance with due respect, I would ask you once again to please check your phones so that we can then proceed with the proceedings. With that, it's my great honor to now give the floor to Ms. Nadia Murad. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you as well to Ambassador Woodward and to the United Kingdom for organizing this important debate as one of your signature events and for inviting me to brief today. Ladies, gentlemen, and dear friends, we are gathered at a moment of global instability, a moment shaped by pandemic, war, and a climate crisis. In times like this, issues that affect women and girls, issues like conflict-related sexual violence, tend to be pushed aside, as though they are somehow secondary to the real issues. But the truth is, these are precisely the moments when protecting, supporting, and investing in women and girls should be urgent priorities. For every setback our societies face, women and girls are forced 10 steps back. This is particularly true in times of conflict. History shows that whenever armed conflict erupts anywhere in the world, rape and brutality follow. We are seeing this in Ukraine as we speak, with reports of sexual violence that should alarm us all. Sexual violence is not a side effect of conflict. It is a tactic of war as old as time. Groups like ISIS understand the destabilizing effect of gender-based violence. and so must we. ISIS began targeting my Yazidi community in 2014. Thousands of Yazidis were massacred. Others fled on foot, facing thirst, starvation, and blistering temperatures. In addition to the murders, ISIS captured more than 6,000 Yazidi women and children. Women and girls like me, my nieces, and my sisters were sold and raped. Those of us who survived were considered lucky. But the nightmare continues even now, 8 years later, for more than 2,800 women and children who are still living in captivity and sexual violence at the hands of ISIS. We are here today to discuss accountability, not only in the aftermath of conflict-related sexual violence, but importantly as a tool to prevent such violence from occurring in the first place. In particular, there is three aspects of accountability I would like to highlight: justice, support for survivors, and a commitment to gender equity in the long term. The pursuit of justice is one of the most visible forms of accountability. Last year, a German court convicted an ISIS member of genocide. It was the first time this had ever happened anywhere in the world. This historic verdict is an important step. But standing before you today, my question is, what next? ISIS led a systemic campaign of sexual violence to destroy Yazidi women and the Yazidi community. The United Nations has condemned their actions as genocide. UNITAD has collected reams of evidence documenting the atrocities ISIS committed against women and girls. And other terrorist groups and oppressive regimes have watched as ISIS members openly brag about enslaving Yazidi women and girls while facing few, if any, consequences on the world stage. As survivors of sexual violence, it is not easy for us to tell our stories. But we do it to prevent what happened to us from happening to others. We are called brave, but the courage we really want to see is from leaders in a position to do something, whether they are heads of state, member states here at the UN, or corporate leaders. We need more than moral outrage. We need action. To those of you assembled in this chamber, now is your moment to put ISIS on trials for genocide and sexual violence. Send the case to the International Criminal Court, or establish a hybrid court by treaty to prosecute ISIS crimes. In the meantime, other nations should follow Germany's example and use the principle of universal jurisdiction to try war criminals for the atrocities they commit, including sexual violence. All of these things matter too. Documenting sexual violence is crucial for accountability and prevention. But too often, survivors who speak out face shame, stigma, and lack of transparency about how our testimonies will or will not be used, or the likely outcomes. That is why I look forward to joining Lord Ahmed tomorrow to officially announce the Murad Code, a set of guidelines intended to change norms around how journalists, investigators, and anyone tasked with documenting and investigating conflict-related sexual violence interacts with survivors. These guidelines were shaped by feedback from survivors around the globe and aim to promote greater respect, understanding, transparency, and healing. In conclusion, accountability can be a crucial component of prevention, but only if it includes meaningful justice. The services and support survivors need, and the ultimate goal of advancing global gender equity. Each of you in this room has the power to make this a reality, only if you choose to act. Everywhere I go, I meet survivors of sexual violence who are bravely telling their stories in the face of stigma, shame, and even physical danger. If women who have suffered such immense loss and incredible pain can find the strength to not only rebuild our lives, but help our families, communities, and entire countries, surely the rest of the world can find the strength to take meaningful steps to end sexual violence in conflict. As survivors, we look to you, the leaders in this room, to act with the same courage we have shown. Survivors do not want pity. We want justice. Thank you, Mr. President.
I now give the floor to Ms. Helina Birhanu. The floor is yours.
Mr. President, distinguished representatives of member states, and honored attendees, thank you for allowing me to bring the stories of Ethiopian women to the chamber of the Security Council. I speak to you today as an Ethiopian woman, one who has heard these testimonies and seen these injured firsthand in Tigray, one who carries the guilt of survival in silence. Today, I hope to do justice to the experience of millions of Ethiopian women who suffered in this war. In this briefing, I'll focus on 6 points in relation to conflict-related sexual violence in Ethiopia since the war began in Tigray in November 2020 and expanded to neighboring regions of Amhara and Afar. These points are directly drawn from human rights investigations and reports that have been made public, as well as on my own visits to the region. First, rape has been perpetrated systematically and used as a tactic of war. It is framed as a means of reprisal and leveraged as a bonding tool for members of allied military forces. When the war first started, Blaine, a 21-year-old waitress from Badime, along with 30 other Tigrayan women, was held against her will and subjected to sexual slavery, starvation, and gang rape by a group of Eritrean and Ethiopian soldiers who took turns with her. I documented many other stories like Blaine's during multiple visits to the region of Tigray before June 2021. Sexual violence was used to terrorize communities as a bonding tool amongst allied Eritrean Defense Forces, Ethiopian National Defense Force, Amhara Regional Militia, and special forces through the shared experiences of exploiting women's bodies. The consistency across victims' accounts show that these crimes were committed intentionally with a degree of organization and planning. Second, sexual violence is ethnically motivated. A Tigrayan woman was fleeing the conflict zone with her children. Along the way, she encountered the Amhara militia, who separated her from her family, gang raped her, and inserted a hot metal rod into her uterus. They declared, a Tigrayan should never give birth. Similar incidents of rape with claims of cleansing Tigrayan blood and mutilating women's bodies to prevent the birth of more generations of Tigrayans have been extensively covered by different human rights reports. And third, sexual violence is used to humiliate survivors and their communities. Sexual violence has often been perpetrated in front of family members. An Amhara woman was beaten and raped in the presence of her husband and a child by 2 Tigrayan force members. she and her children witnessed her husband being killed as she tried to stop the assault. Men and boys were also sexually assaulted. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission found in Samra, town of Tigray, 600 men and boys were stripped and forcibly paraded, some completely naked, while Eritrean female soldiers mocked them and took pictures. And fourth, women with disabilities and other vulnerable communities have been at particular risk during this conflict. Many women with disabilities were specifically targeted in the region of Tigray, as they were presumed to be fighters of the previous war. Girls, elderly women, and women belonging to minority and indigenous communities also face higher risks. The lack of access to the region for independent human rights monitoring has made it difficult to document the impact of the conflict in minority communities, and especially those living in disputed areas on the Eritrean border, such as Europe and Kunama and Tigray. And fifth, the conflict in northern Ethiopia and the effective siege of the Tigray region in particular has undermined women's rights, including access to reproductive health care and psychosocial support, exacerbating the impacts of sexual violence. In May 2021, I visited a shelter supported by Mekelle University in Tigray, where many lactating mothers and their infants had taken refuge. These women, some of whom had survived sexual assault while being pregnant, could not access timely sexual and reproductive care, owed mainly to widespread destruction of medical facilities and limited deliveries of aid due to the government blockade of the region. The conflict in northern Ethiopia has increased women's vulnerabilities irrespective of their ethnicity. I carry with me the story of Khadija, a 9-month pregnant woman from Afar who fled the shelling of Abala town by Tigray Defense Forces with her 5 children and elderly mother. She gave birth under a tree after working for 9 days, 2 of which while in labor. In a country with one of the highest maternal mortality rates globally and lack of infrastructure, specifically in pastoral communities and areas, the conflict immediately puts the lives of many Ethiopian women in grave danger. Lack of access to psychosocial support services also means that the mental health of survivors hangs in the balance. Many have already died by suicide. The story of a 50-year-old Amhara woman from Shawarobit in central Ethiopia was gang raped by Tigrayan fighters in the presence of her son in the next room and later died of suicide highlights how tragic the situation is. Initial reports also indicate disproportionate rates of suicide amongst internally displaced persons across different parts of Tigray. And amid a total internet and telecom blackout, I fear the extent of the trauma felt by the community remains unknown. And 6, while cases of sexual violence from Tigray, Afar, and Amhara have attracted international attention, women from other communities across Ethiopia, specifically from that of the Oromo, Gumuz, Konso, Kamant, and Somali, specifically Ogaden, continue to experience conflict-related sexual violence, including by state forces, without any attention from the international community. Mr. President, members of the Council, the central theme of today's open debate is accountability for sexual violence. Security Council Resolution 2467 recalls the critical role of national investigations. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and UN Office for Human Rights were able to conduct a joint investigation, which was limited in scope and analysis. But unfortunately, and more broadly, we have witnessed deliberate delays of investigation, withholding of information, failings of the justice system, and destruction of evidence, including statistical records, and harassment and detention of journalists by the Ethiopian state and allied parties to the conflict. As we've seen in other contexts and in the spilling of this war into the broader northern region, lack of accountability and justice for past crimes continue to fuel a sense of grievances that drives a vicious cycle of retaliatory attacks. Based on the trends and the stories that I just highlighted, I would like to offer the following recommendations to the members of the Security Council. First, use your platform to demand that efforts to document, investigate, and prevent sexual violence and conflicts are survivor-centered and conducted in a dignified, safe, and confidential manner. As part of the pursuit of justice for survivors, the Security Council should also champion the work of the recently established International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, including by urging all parties to the conflict to fully cooperate and provide unimpeded access to the Commission. And second, the Council should demand that all parties ensure full and safe humanitarian access to Tigray and other areas of conflict, and ensure that humanitarian aid prioritizes the needs of survivors. This includes comprehensive sexual and reproductive health care and addressing stigma. Service providers must also continue to adhere to core humanitarian standards, including interagency standing committee guidelines on gender-based violence and mental health and psychosocial support. And finally, I call on the A3, the 3 African countries in the Security Council, who can be counted as some of the strongest voices of women, peace and security in this chamber. I urge them to work here and in the African Union through its Peace and Security Council, which has the mandate to request a proactive intervention from the AU Special Envoy on Women, Peace and Security, and to take a harder look at the prevailing view that supporting investigations of all conflict-related sexual violence in Ethiopia could somehow derail the proposed reform agenda of the current government. Excellencies, this war has been so devastating to witness. First, because of the sheer scale of human suffering, and second, because many Ethiopians defended this violence in the name of patriotism. But my patriotism, my political loyalty, and my allegiance lie exclusively and firmly with Ethiopian women. And I thank you for inviting one of them to speak to you today.
I thank Ms. Birhanu again for a very powerful testimony and statement.
In Ethiopia, we are horrified by the numerous reports of, and from what we heard from Helina, systematic rape and gender-based violence. And we welcome the Commission of Experts established by the Human Rights Council to investigate allegations of human rights violation and abuses by all parties. This is essential for accountability, prevention, and reconciliation.